to welcome you here at the Hertie School in our Spotlight event, which is part of the Pariser Platz Dialogue series aiming at furthering Franco-German cooperation in Europe. The event series was initiated by the late Hendrik Enderlein, our former president, who worked at the European Central Bank about 24 years ago. It was on this very stage that Hendrik Enderlein welcomed Mario Draghi, your predecessor, in 2018 to discuss the future of European monetary union and the single market with the German finance minister, a certain Olaf Scholz. Tomorrow, we will commemorate the 4th year of Hendrik's passing, so allow me to open with these words in his memory, because I know that he would have been thrilled to welcome you here in person. Let me also start by thanking the Federal Foreign Office and the European Climate Foundation, and of course the colleagues from the Jacques Delors Center under the leadership of Johannes Lindner, another ECB central banker, who worked tirelessly with all other staff units involved to make today's event possible. This afternoon, we want to talk about the growing global fragmentation we are witnessing every morning when we open the newspapers. It is deeply concerning to wonder if the multilateral architecture the US helped to build for 8 decades might survive the coming years. Who can say with certainty whether the US government intends to tear it down, leave us the keys to it out of disinterest, or change course and step back on their disengagement? In these turbulent times, we're experiencing an odd mix of varying feelings, from utter dismay to anger and the energy of hope. As Europeans, we cannot just stand aside in awe and wait for others to lead the way. We need to define our own answers and decide how we will defend multilateralism, how Europe can offer a beacon of stability to those who understand the value of cooperation across borders for our common good. Moreover, our societies cannot prosper if independence from governments is put into question for many key institutions. Indeed, the need for autonomy is shared by central banks and universities, which some would like to see as the mouthpieces of the executive, a power move which only proves that we both have something extremely valuable that we produce. It may thus come without surprise that the current US administration attempts to interfere with both the Federal Reserve and its most prestigious universities. These turbulent times are the chance for European moment, and I'm extremely grateful that we have the privilege to discuss it with an exceptional guest, a guest who will play a major role in formulating our European answers. Dear Christine Lagarde, it is an honor to host you here as the President of the European Central Bank. But I would like to present you also as one of our most experienced, cool-headed crisis managers, probably the most cool-headed crisis manager of our times. You entered into public office after an impressive career in the private sector to become Minister of the Economy in France from 2007 to 2011, with barely a year to learn the ropes before coordinating the response to the 2008 global financial crisis. You became Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund from 2011 to 2019 in the midst of the European debt crisis. And you have been the ECB President since November 2019, more or less immediately confronted with the global pandemic, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, an energy crisis, soaring inflation, and now a major trade conflict. This is just a flavor of the crises you managed in public office, but I'm certain that being the chairperson of the international law firm Baker & McKenzie, which you became at only 43 years as a foreigner and as a woman, also held a share of challenges. I will not bore the audience with a list of offices you held as the first woman ever, and it's pretty safe to assume that that actually counts for all of the offices you held. Nor do I want to underline that you managed to commute or live between Chicago and Paris and Washington and Frankfurt. However, I do want to say that you're a role model to women and young leaders in many countries across the globe. You're also the only person I know that can stand in the eye of the storm of an economic crisis and explain it gracefully on US television in late-night shows. So yes, if anyone is warning of the next crisis, I will simply respond, bring in Christine Lagarde. For my part, I'm happy to take a blindfold and be guided by you. So I feel somewhat calm, but I do believe this might be the most serious storm Europe has yet to face. But one of the most promising parts of our European project is our common currency, of which you and the governing board of the ECB are the guardians. Ms. Lagarde, you are without a doubt among the people most well informed about the intricacies of the European economy and the possibilities to address many of the challenges ahead. It is a great privilege to have you here with us today to hear directly from you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the President of the European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde.
Okay, I'm going to organize. Madame la Présidente, dear Cornelia, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs les professeurs, cher Johannes, and everybody else for that matter, thank you so much for joining this lecture, which will take all of you, I hope, through the arcane of what it takes to become an international currency. So any other questions that you have unrelated to this particular topic, save them for later. And if you have no interest in currency matters, please be patient. But that was a topic which we thought might be of interest to many in the current circumstances, which, Madam President, you've described very concisely, but very deeply as well. So I'm going to take you through the story of reserve currencies, and I will look at that with in mind what could happen in the future and what the conditions could be of Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs les professeurs, cher Johannes, and everybody else for that matter, thank you so much for joining this lecture, which will take all of you, I hope, through the arcane of what it takes to become an international currency. So any other questions that you have unrelated to this particular topic, save them for later. And if you have no interest in currency matters, please be patient. But that was a topic which we thought might be of interest to many in the current circumstances, which, Madam President, you've described very concisely, but very deeply as well. So I'm going to take you through the story of reserve currencies, and I will look at that with in mind what could happen in the future and what the conditions could be of some possible change. Okay? So over the past 80 years, the global economy thrived on a foundation of openness and multilateralism, underpinned by US leadership. By championing a rules-based international system and anchoring the dollar as the world's reserve currency, the United States set the stage to flourish, for trade to flourish and for finance to expand. The global order proved extremely beneficial for Europe, whose founding liberal principles aligned seamlessly with it. But today, as you hinted, this is fracturing. Multilateral cooperation is being replaced by zero-sum thinking and bilateral power plays. Openness is giving way to protectionism, and there is even uncertainty about the cornerstone of the system, the dominant role of the US dollar. All else equal, this fracturing can pose risks for Europe. Our economy is deeply integrated into the global trading system, with exports accounting for close to 1/5 of our value added, and it supports 30 million jobs in Europe. Any change in the international order that leads to lower world trade or fragmentation into economic blocs will be detrimental to our economy. Sad. Yes, but with the right policy responses, there could also be opportunities. The changing landscape could open the door for the euro to play a greater international role. So what is the situation today? Today, the euro is the second global currency, accounting for around 20% of foreign exchange reserves, compared with 58% in the case of the US dollar. So 20% euro, 58% US dollar. Increasing the international role of the euro can have positive implications for the euro area. Let me mention 3 of them. First, it would allow EU governments and businesses to borrow at a lower cost, helping boost our internal demand at a time when external demand is becoming less certain. Second, it would insulate us from exchange rate fluctuations, as more trade would be denominated in euro, protecting Europe from more volatile capital flows. And third, it would protect Europe from sanctions or other coercive measures. So in short, it would allow Europe to better control its own destiny, giving us some of what Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, some 60 years ago, called the exorbitant privilege. He was referring to the dollar at the time. So how is this change likely to happen? History suggests that it is far from guaranteed. The euro will not gain influence by default. We will have to earn it. For the euro to increase its global status, history tells us that we need to build on 3 foundations, each of which critical to its success. First foundation, Europe must ensure that it has a solid and credible geopolitical foundation by maintaining steadfast commitment to open trade and underpinning it with security capabilities. Second foundation, Europe must reinforce its economic foundation to make it a top destination for global capital, enabled by deeper and more liquid capital markets. Third foundation, we must bolster our legal foundation by defending the rule of law and by uniting politically so that we can resist external pressure. So before I explore each of those 3 foundations that I have described, I would like to take us back into a little bit of recent history and what that history can teach us. Shifts in the global currency landscape are not unprecedented in monetary history. There have been previous episodes where the world's leading currency issuer has actually taken steps that have called that leadership, its own leadership, into questions, yet without ultimately jeopardizing it. Let me give you 3 circumstances. The US dollar took over from the pound sterling as the world's leading reserve currency in the mid-20s, with its share in foreign exchange reserves rising to 64% in 1931. But this leading position, which it had acquired, did not stop the United States from taking measures to unilaterally change the international monetary order. And I'm not here talking about 1944 and the Bretton Woods institution. I'm talking about 1933, when President Roosevelt suspended gold convertibility to fight the deflationary forces of the Great Depression. He dismissed European demands for fixed exchange rates with the argument that, and I quote him, "the sound internal economic system of a nation is a greater factor in its well-being than the price of its currency." Move forward, 1970s, early 70s, President Nixon ended the Bretton Woods system by unilaterally suspending dollar convertibility to gold and imposing a 10% import tariff. Faced with growing imbalances between US current account deficits and the surpluses of Western Europe and Japan, Treasury Secretary John Connolly, remember, famous for saying, "the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem," declared also, and I quote him, "no longer can considerations of friendship or need or capacity justify the United States carrying so heavy a share of the common burdens." On both occasions, 1933, 1970s, there was a decline in the standing of the US dollar as a foreign reserve currency. In the 30s, it fell from, remember, 64 in 31 to around 20% of global foreign exchange reserves in a matter of a few years. In the 70s, it fell from about 70% to 50% 2 decades later. But on neither of those two occasions, there was a robust alternative currency that could take over on short notice. In the 30s, the pound sterling was already declining, while in the 70s, the Deutschmark and the yen were backed by markets that were too small. So what did investors do? They had no alternative currency. They flocked to gold. The share of gold in foreign reserves increased by about 20 percentage points in the 30s to 70%, and almost double to 60% in the 70s. So they all flocked to gold. Today, I think there is a key difference compared with previous eras. With the euro as the world's second largest currency, there is another international currency alongside the dollar. Well, yes, but some of you have looked at the price of gold and have seen movements. So we have not yet convinced investors. Work to do. Over the recent years, the dollar's share in global foreign exchange reserves has indeed fallen, with its current level of 58% being the lowest since 1994. In parallel, central banks have been accumulating gold at a record pace, almost matching the levels seen during the Bretton Woods era. The share of gold in global foreign reserves has reached around 20%, which is almost on a par with the euro, a little over. So let's now go back to those three foundations that I have mentioned earlier. Three foundations indispensable for a currency to reach that global status of international reserve currency. And in each of the three cases, geopolitical, economic, legal, we will see that Europe has many of the key ingredients for success, but they need to be brought together in order to reinforce the foundations. So action is in order. Let me start with the first one, the geopolitical foundation. The starting point is indeed a credible geopolitical foundation, which rests on both a country's role in global trade, but also on the strength of its military alliances. A currency's exposure to trade is especially important as it provides the initial pathway to wider international use. In the mid-20s, for instance, the dollar overtook the pound sterling as the leading form of trade credit before it became the leading reserve currency. Once a currency captures a larger share of trade invoicing, its role in international banking and finance, and ultimately as a reserve assets, becomes self-reinforcing. Higher demand for the currency enhances its role as a store of value and further encourages investors to hold it. So, as a major actor in global trade, Europe already has a key ingredient of a strong geopolitical foundation, creating the potential for a virtuous circle of Euro internationalization to unfold. Why is that? Well, you know it all. The EU has the largest network of trade agreements in the world. Europe is the #1 trading partner for 72 countries out of about 199, which together, those 72 countries with which we are the first trading partners, represent almost 40% of global GDP. And this status is reflected in the share of the euro as an invoicing currency, which stands at around 40%, more than double its share as a reserve currency. So 20% of the reserves, 40% of the invoicing. Europe can press home this advantage by continuing to forge new trade agreements. And we should make clear that we support a win-win approach to trade, ensuring that we are the most attractive partner to make deals with. We can do deals too. Sorry. The ECB can also help make the euro more attractive for euro-denominated trade. We are working currently, and the work will be completed shortly, on a potential digital euro, and we are pursuing initiatives to enhance cross-border payments in euro, which could potentially facilitate international cross-border transactions in the future. And we know that we have to move fast. We also extend swap lines and repo lines to key partners, and by doing that, we safeguard against euro liquidity shortages abroad, disrupting the smooth transmission of our monetary policy, which in turn encourages those partners to transact more in euro. But there is a limit to how much a currency can grow simply by virtue of being open to trade. In fact, the euro's share of global export invoicing is already today as large as that of the US dollar. But we are not closing the gap in reserve currency status. And this is probably because investors, and especially official investors, also seek geopolitical assurance in another form. They invest in the assets of regions that are reliable security partners and can honor alliances with hard power. So a credible geopolitical foundation must also rest on robust military partnerships. This dual strength, trade and security, is essentially what we can learn from the US dollar's dominance. It is not just a product of economic fundamentals, but it is also powerfully reinforced by US security guarantees. These guarantees not only deepen trade ties, but have been shown to boost a currency's share in foreign reserves by up to 30 percentage points. There is great literature in that respect. But what are we seeing now? We are seeing a major shift in Europe towards rebuilding our hard power, with important initiatives underway at the national, including in Germany, and at the EU levels. And we should be clear that following through with this effort is a precondition for the euro to become more widely used. That's quickly brushed the geopolitical foundation. Let's look now at the economic foundation. To satisfy the demand for an international currency, investors need appropriate assets to invest in. And this is why a strong economic foundation, one that provides opportunities for growth and opportunities to invest in growth, is equally essential. There is a virtuous circle between growth, capital markets, and international currency usage. Growth generates robust rates of return, which makes investors want to hold assets in a particular currency. And capital markets provide investment opportunities and channel funds back into growth. Virtuous circle. At the same time, if capital markets provide a sufficient supply of safe assets, investors can hedge their exposures efficiently. When a shock hits and riskier investments lose value, safer assets rise in value, and that provides a complete ecosystem for investment in the currency. The US dollar's rise to dominance in the interwar period was certainly driven by this vicious circle. The development of US capital markets boosted growth, with each 1 percentage point increase in market cap yielding 0.5 percentage point more growth, while simultaneously establishing the foundation for dollar dominance. The depth and liquidity of the US Treasury market, in turn, provided an efficient hedge for investors so far. Europe, I contend, has all the elements it needs to produce a similar cycle. But so far, we have not been able to put all the pieces together. Despite our large single market, we have fallen behind the United States in terms of growth performance and market returns. Since 2000, US labor productivity per hour has grown twice as much as that in the euro area, mainly driven by the tech sector, and US markets have delivered returns that are around 5 times as high as those in European markets. Despite our large savings, we have made little progress in integrating our capital markets to channel more of our funds into growth. Think of it, 60% of household equity investment, and there is not that much of it, because a lot of it is into savings and term deposit. But 60% of household equity investment goes into home country markets, even though there might be greater opportunities somewhere else in Europe. And despite our strong aggregate fiscal position, our debt to GDP, I remind you, is only 89%, well, I shouldn't say OT, is 89% to GDP, but it compares with 124% for the United States. So we provide, despite these circumstances, relatively few safe assets. Currently, the supply of sovereign bonds with AA or higher credit ratings amounts to just 37% of GDP in the EU, compared with 89% of GDP in the United States. So the conclusion for Europe is clear. If we truly want to see the global status of the euro grow, we must first reform our domestic economy. That means moving towards, with the priorities identified in recent reports, completing the single market, enabling startups, reducing regulation, and building the saving and investment union, which includes the capital market. And it also means avoiding a piecemeal approach where we make progress where it is easy, but we hesitate where it is hard. Or else we will never kickstart the positive virtuous circle that I described earlier. And I think that in the current economic circumstances and geopolitical landscape, the case for acting in a European way has never been stronger. Now, of course, each individual country needs to make sure that its national policies support growth. But we also need to be mindful of self-defeating implementation, where we shoot ourselves in the foot. For example, we all agree that Europe needs to build up its strategic industries to avoid excessive dependencies, as Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi emphasized in their recent reports. But we will not succeed if each and every individual member state defines and goes with its own industrial policy. We will not have the scale. Nowadays, there are also more policy goals that qualify as European public goods. We talked about the military strength and the security earlier on. Well, strengthening European defense, I contend, is a public good. But due to the free rider problem, defense is a good that is likely to be undersupplied. In addition, joining forces to procure equipment and develop new technologies, leading to economies of scale and more interoperability, will result in greater operational effectiveness than if each and every of the 27 member states go it alone. Economic logic tells us that public goods need to be jointly financed. And this joint financing could provide the basis for Europe to gradually increase its supply of safe assets. That's an even larger virtuous circle. Let me now move to my third foundation, the legal one. Geopolitical strength and faster growth can go along 50% of the reserves, 40% of the invoicing. Europe can press home this advantage by continuing to forge new trade agreements, and we should make clear that we support a win-win approach to trade, ensuring that we are the most attractive partner to make deals with. We can do deals too. Sorry. The ECB can also help make the euro more attractive for euro-denominated trade. We are working currently, and the work will be completed shortly, on a potential digital euro, and we are pursuing initiatives to enhance cross-border payments in euro, which could potentially facilitate international cross-border transactions in the future. And we know that we have to move fast. We also extend swap lines and repo lines to key partners, and by doing that, we safeguard against euro liquidity shortages abroad, disrupting the smooth transmission of our monetary policy, which in turn encourages those partners to transact more in euro. But there is a limit to how much a currency can grow simply by virtue of being open to trade. In fact, the euro's share of global export invoicing is already today as large as that of the US dollar. But we are not closing the gap in reserve currency status. And this is probably because investors, and especially official investors, also seek geopolitical assurance in another form. They invest in the assets of regions that are reliable security partners and can honor alliances with hard power. So a credible geopolitical foundation must also rest on robust military partnerships. This dual strength, trade and security, is essentially what we can learn from the US dollar's dominance. It is not just a product of economic fundamentals, but it is also powerfully reinforced by US security guarantees. These guarantees not only deepen trade ties, but have been shown to boost a currency's share in foreign reserves by up to 30 percentage points. There is great literature in that respect. But what are we seeing now? We are seeing a major shift in Europe towards rebuilding our hard power, with important initiatives underway at the national, including in Germany, and at the EU levels. And we should be clear that following through with this effort is a precondition for the euro to become more widely used. That's quickly brushed the geopolitical foundation. Let's look now at the economic foundation. To satisfy the demand for an international currency, investors need appropriate assets to invest in. And this is why a strong economic foundation, one that provides opportunities for growth and opportunities to invest in growth, is equally essential. There is a virtuous circle between growth, capital markets, and international currency usage. Growth generates robust rates of return, which makes investors want to hold assets in a particular currency. And capital markets provide investment opportunities and channel funds back into growth. Virtuous circle. At the same time, if capital markets provide a sufficient supply of safe assets, investors can hedge their exposures efficiently. When a shock hits and riskier investments lose value, safer assets rise in value, and that provides a complete ecosystem for investment in the currency. The US dollar's rise to dominance in the interwar period was certainly driven by this virtuous circle. The development of US capital markets boosted growth, with each 1 percentage point increase in market cap yielding 0.5 percentage point more growth, while simultaneously establishing the foundation for dollar dominance. The depth and liquidity of the US Treasury market, in turn, provided an efficient hedge for investors so far. Europe, I contend, has all the elements it needs to produce a similar cycle. But so far, we have not been able to put all the pieces together. Despite our large single market, we have fallen behind the United States in terms of growth performance and market returns. Since 2000, US labor productivity per hour has grown twice as much as that in the euro area, mainly driven by the tech sector, and US markets have delivered returns that are around 5 times as high as those in European markets. Despite our large savings, we have made little progress in integrating our capital markets to channel more of our funds into growth. Think of it, 60% of household equity investment, and there is not that much of it, because a lot of it is into savings and term deposit. But 60% of household equity investment goes into home country markets, even though there might be greater opportunities somewhere else in Europe. And despite our strong aggregate fiscal position, our debt to GDP, I remind you, is only 89%, well, I shouldn't say OT, is 89% to GDP, but it compares with 124% for the United States. So we provide, despite these circumstances, relatively few safe assets. Currently, the supply of sovereign bonds with AA or higher credit ratings amounts to just 37% of GDP in the EU, compared with 89% of GDP in the United States. So the conclusion for Europe is clear. If we truly want to see the global status of the euro grow, we must first reform our domestic economy. That means moving towards, with the priorities identified in recent reports, completing the single market, enabling startups, reducing regulation, and building the saving and investment union, which includes the capital market. And it also means avoiding a piecemeal approach where we make progress where it is easy, but we hesitate where it is hard. Or else we will never kickstart the positive virtuous circle that I described earlier. And I think that in the current economic circumstances and geopolitical landscape, the case for acting in a European way has never been stronger. Now, of course, each individual country needs to make sure that its national policies support growth. But we also need to be mindful of self-defeating implementation, where we shoot ourselves in the foot. For example, we all agree that Europe needs to build up its strategic industries to avoid excessive dependencies, as Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi emphasized in their recent reports. But we will not succeed if each and every individual member state defines and goes with its own industrial policy. We will not have the scale. Nowadays, there are also more policy goals that qualify as European public goods. We talked about the military strength and the security earlier on. Well, strengthening European defense, I contend, is a public good. But due to the free rider problem, defense is a good that is likely to be undersupplied. In addition, joining forces to procure equipment and develop new technologies, leading to economies of scale and more interoperability, will result in greater operational effectiveness than if each and every of the 27 member states go it alone. Economic logic tells us that public goods need to be jointly financed. And this joint financing could provide the basis for Europe to gradually increase its supply of safe assets. That's an even larger virtuous circle. Let me now move to my third foundation, the legal one. Geopolitical strength and faster growth can go a long way towards strengthening the euro's international role. But maintaining demand for the currency will also depend on our ability to uphold a robust legal and institutional foundation. Ultimately, currencies achieve and maintain their reserve status if the institutions and the policies backing them consistently safeguard investors' confidence in their longer-term value. For example, historically, the US dollar preeminence has rested on the strength and stability of US fiscal and monetary institutions. The Federal Reserve System's credible commitment to controlling inflation, combined with the unparalleled liquidity of the US Treasury market, created a perception of minimal sovereign risk. This made the dollar a safe haven during global economic turbulences and recessions. Since 1970, there have been 34 instances, 34, of simultaneous sovereign debt and financial crisis globally. I did not work on every 34, only a few. But you know what? The US has always remained immune. But when doubt emerges about the stability of the legal and institutional framework, the impact on currency use is undeniable and fast. These doubts have materialized in the form of highly unusual cross-asset correlations since April 2nd this year, with the US dollar and the US Treasuries experiencing sell-offs even as equities fail. Very unusual movement. The same doubts are also mentioned by investors who are turning to gold. 2/5 say they're doing so as a hedge against rising geopolitical risk. given this context, the EU has a legitimate reason to turn its commitment to predictable policymaking and the rule of law into a comparative advantage. This commitment is baked into how the EU works. The positive side of our often slow and complicated decision-making processes, yes, is that checks and balances are always respected. We have also enshrined into law the independence of our key institutions, like the ECB, in ways that are hard for politicians to threaten. But relying on the fact that our bureaucratic systems are hard to change is not enough. In the current geopolitical environment, we are facing increasing external pressures to take action that jeopardize the rule of law. And we will only be able to resist these pressures if we are more politically united and able to speak with a single voice. As we potentially enter a renewed era of great power rivalry, with countries being asked to take side, we are likely to find ourselves under pressure to make decisions that are not necessarily in our own interest. But if we take this opportunity to unite, and preferably to reform our institutional structure by enabling more qualified majority voting in areas where a single vote has often held back the collective interest of the 26 other countries, that would enable us to act decisively as a united Europe. We would then be in a much stronger position to defend and uphold our values, and as a result, to defend and uphold the global confidence that is associated with an international reserve currency. So I've described for you those three foundations: the current situation, a bit of the history and what the US has had the benefit of, and I have flashed for you what it would take for those three foundations to be strengthened, brought together, in order to strengthen our currency and earn the confidence of investors. In the history of the international monetary system, there are moments when the foundations that once seemed unshakable suddenly begin to shake. The Belgian-American economist Robert Triffin described this with great clarity. He observed that nations' confidence in the international monetary system depends on the reliability of the reserve currency, which, to use his own words, is highly dependent on individual countries' decisions. But moments of change can also be moments of opportunity. The ongoing changes create the opening for a global euro moment. And this is a prime opportunity for Europe to take greater control of its own destiny. But let's not fool ourselves. It is not a privilege that will be bestowed upon us because of who we are, what we stand for, and the values we uphold. It will have to be earned together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was a very sharp analysis and a great lecture, which I think was particularly apt for the Hertie School, a lecture on international political economy, but also politically at a very right time here in Berlin with a new government just having taken office. You've described what I took from you, two important points. One is we may have the opportunity to take some of the exorbitant privilege that the dollar has at the moment, but this will not come naturally or automatically, but we have to, as you say, earn it, advancing on three foundations. And if you allow me, I would like to drill down briefly in our talk, and then I open up to the audience on these three foundations. And I would start with the one that is maybe closest to what the European Union has tried the most over the last 50 years, and that's really the economic foundation. This has been an economic project, first and foremost. And I would like to zoom in to what you nicely described as this triangle: growth, capital market integration, and the role of the euro. And you mentioned the Saving and Investment Union, as you said, the new name that combines banking union and capital markets union. And the idea is really that to deepen capital markets and to mobilize private capital. And you yourself have been very vocal on this, also pointing out that we are seeing a capital flight, if one can call it that way, of 300 billion a year going to the US and not invested here. Now, the political progress on that project has not been breathtaking, to put it a bit mildly. So I would be interested in your view, and maybe I'm too critical here, but in your view on what would be your priorities, both in terms of impact, taking into account the international role of Europe, but also in terms of political feasibility.
Thank you very much, Johannes. I think we need a dose of humility when we face this Capital Market Union project. It has been around for about 12 years. And one of my good friends, Jean-Claude Juncker, was one of the first to talk about it and to argue in favor of it. So why is it that it hasn't worked? I think we should start with that. And that's what I mean by the sort of an exercise of humility. Why has it not worked? And I see a few reasons. One is, it's not a very sexy project. You know, when you talk to a big room of voters, which is what politicians have to do, and you start talking about capital market union, you know, the moment you utter those words, you've lost about 2/3 of the audience, number one. So I think we need to, you know, if my assessment is correct, we need to find a way, we need to find the narrative which speaks to the voters, because that project has to be carried not by the technocrats, not by the central bankers, not by the market authorities themselves, and I'll come to that, but it has to be carried with political drive and with a momentum that actually accelerates the process, because we need to move fast. So we need to be able to tell the stories of those companies, of those startups, of those innovators, of those, you know, smart people who need at some stage a first round of financing, okay, the business angel, the family members, a second circle of financing, capital ventures if they are around, and then a third one and a fourth one. And here you need really a lot more money, and they need to access capital via the markets, whether it is in a simplified way or a tortured way, whatever, but they need to access the money. And I think we need to tell those stories rather than, you know, sort of trumpet capital market union, capital market union. In the audience of highly civilized and well-read experts like in this room, it's okay because you all understand what CMU can do. But it's the politicians who have to carry the project. So that's number one. And speaking of those politicians, by the way, I really think that now, except for a couple of countries which have vested interests, most of the political leaders at the European Council, for instance, are convinced that this has to happen because they see how much saving we have. You know, we save 15% here in Europe. In the US, they save 4%, and yet they have a much deeper and more liquid capital market. So I think they're convinced of the momentum and they're ready to support the project. We need to help them with the narratives, and I'm sure that top-notch communicators will be able to help with that. So that's number one, political momentum, making it a bit sexy. Number two, we have to look at how much vested interest there are and how they can be addressed. Because, you know, if you tell all the market supervisors of Europe, sorry, your job is gone, it's going to be in one location, which will have authority over the entire European Union, they are not going to be happy supporting that project. So we need, those who will, the Commission, the Council, Parliament ultimately, need to identify a structure and a framework where these people who have expertise actually can continue working, can be efficient, but will have a harmonized set of rules and a harmonized interpretation of the rules. Because what we have at the moment is a set of rules, yes, but interpreted in 27 different ways. So if you are a big fund investor or asset manager, you need to comply with 27 different sets of rules. That is not very enticing. So we need to have that as well. And to address that, we need to understand what the concerns are, what the vested interests are, and how they can find their sitting in the organization. Then, okay, so I'm coming now to my third and I'll stop. So political momentum, making the project really attractive and sexy, addressing the vested interest in order to arrive at a harmonized supervision interpreted in the same way. And again, it opens lots of, subsets of questions. I think the third point that I would make has already a response, but I don't know how it will be developed, and that is the 28th regime. Because when you operate in multiple member states, you typically have to comply with a particular set of rules and, more importantly, interpretations on corporate law, on tax law, on bankruptcy law, on employees' representatives, and so on and so forth. And it makes the whole exercise very complicated. Whereas if you could have, I know the Commission doesn't like that particular project much, but I think it's moving in that direction nonetheless. Have a 28th regime that would have the same corporate law, the same bankruptcy law, the same tax law, the same sort of labor representatives law. It would simplify significantly, and it would give a passport throughout the member states for those who decide to elect for this status.
Unleashing a dynamic where people can choose that. Yeah. So 28th regime and supervisory convergence, if not maybe a unification of supervisory powers. Can I move on to something still in the economic field that I find fascinating, which was your point on the need to address the investment needs, both in the defense side, but also in infrastructure, maybe specific sectors, as well as your warning, if it's only done at the national level, that this would lead to fragmentation and run the risk of missing out on scale and synergies. Now, having that in mind, what's your assessment of the new German government's decision to really have that big investment fund, it's 1% GDP per year, as well as an additional 1.5% defense spending?
Well, look, I'm not going to pass judgment on any government in the European Union nor in the euro area, but I observe that this decision was extremely well received by markets. Okay, so if that is the case, then there is an expectation that it will work and that it will unleash growth potential. It's a national project, but it's one that was also not only welcomed by markets, but it was welcomed by all the partners around Germany. And if you topple that with the fact that German leadership and French leadership seem to want to privilege the strength of the relationship that they have had and the joint projects that they can work together, I see that as extremely positive for the European Union and certainly for the euro area, yes. But it doesn't undermine my other point, which is that it cannot be only a series of national projects. There has to be enough commonality, enough coordination and strategic development selected together, because otherwise we will end up with X design of tanks, drones, infrastructure that will not properly coordinate, for instance, in the energy grid, and as was the case in railroad enlargement.
So I understand you would favor, in addition to the national strategy, in addition to the coordination, also maybe a reform of the EU budget that would focus much more on this public goods aspect that you've identified.
You're pushing the envelope a bit.
Okay.
No, but I do have in my speech the reference to the fact that when there is an undeniable common good, economics would suggest that this common good be financed jointly by those who will ultimately benefit from the common good. And it's pretty obvious that defense comes as a priority.
Can I move on to the very interesting point you made on geopolitical foundations? And I was wondering whether there isn't a bit of a tension. You say on the one hand, Europe should really enforce its role in terms of defending open trade, have new trading partners, have even new trade agreements, maybe trade agreements that then also are denominated in euro. And at the same time, there's also, in a fragmented world, the need to stand up for your interest and to have strategic autonomy, to take sides, to maybe have defensive trade instruments. Do you see a tension there, or does that go hand in hand?
You know, developments, growth, selection of priorities always create tensions. And yes, there are tensions. You know, we need to improve our competitiveness. At the same time, we need to fight against climate change. Are they mutually exclusive? Are they consistent with each other? In the short term, in the long term, you have different responses. And I think it's going to be the tribute of the politicians to actually manage to find that thin line that will first, you know, protect the national interest by avoiding negative externalities, excessive dependence, as we have seen in the last 5 years, but also defending these key values that have served us well and which are, you know, a clear indication of who we are, which is, you know, this democratic environment, the rule of law, the respect of it, and the open trade with partners with whom we have trade agreements. And in those trade, I think actually the thin line can actually go through those trade agreements, which, if comprehensive enough and including not only movement of goods, but also provisions regarding the protection against climate change and the protection of the environment, also the protection of labor rights and so on and so forth, as we have, for instance, with Canada.
Although the tendency at the moment is to be rather critical towards some of these aspects that are seen as too complicated, making the ratification for these agreements sometimes a bit more difficult, no?
I think, you know, the situation is changing.
But coming to that last foundation, because it's about unity, and I thought it was interesting how you conceded the fact that sometimes the EU is seen as rather complex, and that the political unity at the same time, especially if you want to be a strong actor on the global stage, needs to be there, the unity, but that some of the complexity of our decision-making maybe stand in the way. Now, you mentioned qualified majority voting. Of course, we know treaty change is difficult to achieve. Now, in the past, and you've experienced that very much yourself, you were at the forefront, the cooperation between France and Germany, you mentioned it briefly just now, the leadership that provided wasn't a way of bringing kind of unity or at least leadership to the Union. How do you, I mean, as of recently, there have been maybe less leadership provided by France and Germany, but how are you seeing that new impetus, that sort of self-proclaimed reset, maybe even renaissance that the new German government wants to achieve?
Well, it's, you know, if that materializes, which we all hope, it will be a blessing. You know, I go back to the COVID era, where the good and solid relationship between Chancellor Merkel and President Macron helped the European Union to navigate the COVID crisis by putting in place something that was unheard of. You know, the Recovery and Resilience Fund, 650 billion euros, which is being allocated to countries in a non-linear way or non-capital keys related way, was an incredible response that nobody would have thought of. You know, move back in the past, 2 years before COVID, if anybody had said, we will borrow jointly, some of it will be grant, some of it will be loans, and it will be shared equally, but it will be distributed unevenly, it wouldn't, everybody would have said, you are dreaming. And yet, 2 years later, first by agreement between these two leaders, and then by agreement with all leaders included, it happened. And it was joint borrowing. Now everybody said, oh, it's ad hoc, it will not happen again. Well, there's so many things that were never going to happen, and yet happened.
Very good. I would like to open up because I know there are a lot of people that wanted to ask questions. I will give priority to students because this is a university, and I want to encourage many of you to not to be shy and to have the unique opportunity to ask President Lagarde a question. Now, please get up and
Say your name.
Exactly. Maybe here, yeah.
Thank you, President Lagarde, for this very interesting speech. My name is Martin Fischer. I'm a PhD student at the European University Institute and currently a visiting scholar at the Jacques Delors Center. And I have two questions on the role of the euro, because the first one is more general. It concerns the link between what you just spoke about and the mandate that the ECB actually has. Because it sounds as if the European Union is becoming a geopolitical player. But at the same time, the ECB's mandate is price stability. So what are the implications of what you just talked about on the ECB's mandate? Does it maybe even jeopardize it? The second question concerns the third pillar that you mentioned on solid legal foundations and the rule of law. And at the moment, what is happening in Europe is that we are discussing whether Russian assets should be frozen to finance the support for Ukraine. So is there not an inherent tension between this geopolitical role of Europe and the rule of law foundation that you mentioned? Thank you.
Let me just collect maybe a couple of more questions. Just at the back, just a bit of more variation. Yeah.
Thank you for the floor. I'm Federico Campatelli, member of the Future Youth Student Club here at the Hertie School. President Lagarde, the uncertainty that you've mentioned around US government policies and the shaking foundations of the global order make markets increasingly seek European safe assets, perhaps even over US government bonds. And you've also mentioned the necessity to fund common goods at the European level. I'm wondering, are these strong enough incentives for common issuance at the EU level? And to what extent is establishing a European safe asset a key factor for enabling deeper capital markets integration? Thank you.
First, here, the lady with the black hair, please.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente. Hello, everybody. My name is Sima Kamourier. I'm the Executive Director for Climate at the Finance for Development Lab. It's a small think tank housed at the Paris School of Economics. So I've long ceased to be a student, but thanks for taking my question nonetheless. Well, theoretically, I learned my first jobs as an economist at the French Treasury under your stewardship, Madame Lagarde, some 15 years ago. So I just wanted to, I'm sorry? Thanks, I'll take it. I just wanted to pick up on a comment you made about hesitating in front of difficult choices or hard choices, and the length that it takes to create deep and liquid capital markets and the search of investors for safe assets. You briefly just mentioned climate change. It remains, it remains a danger, whether we like it or not, whether other priorities have taken the top spot in the political agenda and the investment agenda, indeed. How do you see our capacity to reconcile our current challenges with the need to prepare for and indeed actually invest in the transition, could this actually be an opportunity to play a very long game in terms of creating a new type of safe assets? And could Europe play a very, long-term competitive game here? I'd be really interested in your views, especially that the ECB has been at the forefront of that movement. Thank you very much.
So Hertie is providing you with difficult questions. Back to you.
That's for sure. So I'll take them by their respective order. On the first one, I think one of you said, isn't you mandate price stability at risk and in jeopardy, given what you've just explained to us today? I really don't think that it is the case. I would like to just remind you, by the way, that we have delivered on our mandate. Moving the inflation from 11.6 in October 22 to 2.1 where it is now, thanks notably, not exclusively, but thanks notably through our monetary policy, is a clear indication that we are observing our mandate very carefully. And I can assure you that the Governing Council of the ECB, which comprises the 20 governors of the national central banks, have at heart to deliver on that mandate. So that mandate, I also remind you, is twofold. We have the primary objective, which is price stability, and it comes first and foremost. And then without prejudice to the first priority, which is price stability, we also have to observe the economic policies and the developments that are decided by the European institutions. But I really do not think that by strengthening the role of the euro, we would jeopardize our price stability primary objective. I actually would argue for the contrary and the opposite. Your second question requires just a little bit of distinction between the concept. Because I believe that the central bank, the Russian central bank assets have actually been frozen, and they are frozen. And second, they are being used currently in order to finance some of the lending that has been extended to Ukraine. So when the G7 countries have agreed to lend $50 billion to Ukraine, the interests thereon are actually partly paid by the interest generated by the frozen assets, because it legally stands that those interests generated by the assets do not belong to the National Central Bank of Russia. Now, if you change the word frozen by seized, that's a different story. And I think that there is, at the moment at least, and as constructed, no international legal basis on which to actually seize. But I think it is the intention of all parties involved to actually target all these amounts to the reconstruction of Ukraine. So on the second question had to do with under the current uncertainty and the status of the US assets, do the EU assets stand a chance? And my response, I hope I have demonstrated that in the speech, is yes. And while there is no significant flows as yet observed, there are multiple interrogations, questions, and undecisiveness at the moment on the part of many investors. This is something that is borne by the markets and that we know about. Would the safe assets be enough to organize a capital market union? Well, to have a liquid and deep capital market union, safe assets, I also mentioned that very clearly in my speech, are needed. And it feeds that virtuous circle that I have described earlier on. So I think to that question, the answer is decisively yes. Liquid and deep, and yet with climate change. So how do we combine that? I think we can. I think we can, if only for the reason that investment in climate-friendly projects are long-term investments. And for that to happen, you need to have the stability and the reliability and predictability of the system in which you invest. And I really hope that the European Union can deliver that better and more than anybody else. And thank you for having recognized that we as a central bank are trying to decarbonize as much as is reasonable under the Paris Agreement, our monetary and non-monetary portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to give a second round. There in blonde there with the glasses, and then...
Blonde with glasses, that's a bit funny.
No, yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Luca Derville. I'm a student in the MIA here in European governance. And as you've talked in the third pillar, the legal pillar about reforming Europe, especially the QMV, as much as there's a political momentum at the moment for the EU to do more, there's also a lot of backlash against the EU, especially at the highest levels of state, with a lot of lot of state leaders also going against Europe. Do you still think that we can manage to move with such big reforms, such as the QMV in major policy areas, such as foreign policy?
You see, you're funny because you do the same thing that people have done in all the organizations that I have been called to lead. Because they all talk the same jargon, they talk in abbreviations. So you say QMD, QMD.
QMV, the qualified majority voting.
Thank
Sorry.
you. So now everybody understands.
Could you then maybe pass on just in
Okay.
front of you? There, yeah, another student.
Hi, my name is Theodor Rickert. I'm also a first-year student here at Hertie School. And I'm wondering how you assess the role of the current national capital markets in the role of the capital market union, because we see maybe 24 capital markets in the EU that are relatively shallow and not deep. And we still see that companies they are financing via debt, and whether it is an issue that or how to create a deep and shallow EU-wide capital market if the basis for that is not where we would like to see it.
And then there was another young gentleman there that has raised his hands there.
Thank you, Madame Lagarde, for your insights. My name is Henry. I'm a first-year student here at Hertie. As a matter of fact, I also was a student in George Washington University, then right next door neighbor of the IMF. So the question I wanted to ask is about the second pillar you have mentioned, the political pillar. Over the past years, we have seen the rise of the European far rights across the nations, and it has started attacking the European Union institutions. ECB and Euro as an institution as a whole are also under the attack. How does the European central bank going to do in response of the rising populism and an uncertainty towards the euro? How can the European banking system as a whole to respond to this crisis? Thank you very much.
So two more political questions and one on national capital markets, but I would like to stop now. I know you need to leave at 1:15, but want to give you the chance to respond.
I have to be super fast. Okay. So, national CMU in the scope of the Capital Market Union. I think you raise a really interesting question because, and it comes back to the first discussion that we had, because each of those national capital market will have to find a setting in the Capital Market Union when it is developed. So that begs the question of what is most important. And I would say that the trading and post-trading operations are really important. But what, in my view, comes to mind as well is the rule of law, the rule book, sorry, which has to be harmonized and of which the interpretation has to be totally consistent. Because if when you invest in different member states, you have, on the basis of similar directives, different transpositions in the national legislation and different interpretation of those rules, then you don't have a single market and you cannot go beyond the market for which you have prepared. But how you integrate them and have them respect the supervision mechanisms, the interpretation of the supervisory rules in a consistent way, I would contend that what was put in place for banking supervision with the SSM, and yet the national supervisors who continue to have competences up to a certain level within certain extents and participating in the SSM as part and parcel of it through the supervisory board is one example. There might be better solutions, but this is one that has been tested and that has been in place for 11 years now, and it seems to work. So I think that we should not have as a pretext for not moving the existence of the national capital markets. We need to go beyond that. So I didn't want to skip to QMV question, but thank you for reminding me that abbreviations can sometimes obscure the debate. We need to stay away from that. Absolutely. That's what I always told my teams at Bercy, at the IMF, at the central bank. Consider me as a stupid idiot who doesn't know anything of what you're talking about, and explain, because otherwise you keep others out in the darkness. So qualified majority, I have heard now several leaders, and not the least ones, argue that wherever there is a possibility to decide with qualified majority, they will go for it. And they will not massage and pressure and cajole and exercise leverage in order to obtain consensus. They will be prepared to go for qualified majority. So that's step number one. Step number two, there are areas, and I'm thinking of, you would be thinking of foreign affairs, I would be thinking of tax, which is part of the 28th regime, where, yeah, maybe it's worth looking at the treaties. And as we say in French, nécessité fait loi. Sometimes, as Nelson Mandela would have said, suddenly what seemed impossible becomes possible. And I really believe in that. I've seen it in action. You know, the COVID time taught me that when push comes to shove, people eventually will go beyond the barriers that they thought they could not overcome. On your last one, look, I'm not going to pretend that we are what we are not. A central bank is a central bank is a central bank, just like a rose is a rose is a rose. And there is only so much that we can do. And there is only so much that the treaty has assigned to us. But I believe that by delivering on our treaty obligations, complying with the rules, doing the best we can in order to deliver price stability, is our contribution to a more stable, more predictable, more acceptable world. And we will continue to do that, believe me.
Thank you very, very much for this. You mentioned the global euro moment. And I think you've clearly outlined what that moment should entail. You also said there could be a sort of virtuous cycle. And maybe with a bit of hope, that sort of new momentum, political momentum in terms of leadership could be a kind of a kickstart in that direction of unleashing that virtual cycle. So with this very positive note, I want to thank you a lot for coming to Hertie, to the Jacques Delors Center. Thank you very much, Christine Lagarde.
Nuevo Activia Kéfir, con probióticos naturales y levaduras de kéfir. Buenísimo, te gustará a ti y a tu interior.
Gracias, energías fósiles. Pero es el momento de empezar a separarnos, impulsando también el biocombustible de segunda generación SAF para hacer la aviación más sostenible. CEPSA se transforma en Mueve. Este futuro tiene futuro.
Mueve.
Francisco Quintana, director de estrategia de inversión en ING. Buenos días.
Hola, buenos días, ¿qué tal?
¿Hay que empezar a cotizar también el estado de ánimo de Donald Trump en el mercado?
Desafortunadamente hace muchos meses que el estado de ánimo de Donald Trump es uno de los principales factores explicativos de lo que ocurre en los mercados y de los bandazos que pegan los precios de los activos financieros. O sea, absolutamente sí, ¿no? Ojalá tuviéramos un trampómetro que nos dijera cómo se ha levantado el presidente. Pero sí, sin duda, es un factor muy a tener en cuenta en todos los ámbitos, el geopolítico, los acuerdos comerciales, la cotización del dólar, la evolución de la bolsa, todo.
¿Cómo ves el entorno para el inversor que ha visto volatilidad, incertidumbre, que lo tiene todo ahora mismo? ¿Debe estar buscando opciones o debe hacer una especie de Warren Buffett y mantenerse un poco hasta que pase todo este temporal, sobre todo arancelario?
Personalmente creo que la segunda opción es la más razonable en este momento, ¿no? Hay tantos elementos de incertidumbre en el ambiente, como estaba comentando Yuri, que bueno, cualquier estrategia es justificable, ¿no? Lo que vemos ahora es mucha dispersión entre las recomendaciones de las casas de inversión. El entorno, hay muchas piezas que se están moviendo y digamos que se crean espacios para que cada uno pueda construir una narrativa alrededor de la estrategia que quiera. Pero yo lo que veo es quizás un entorno general en el que hay un poquito de escepticismo, ¿no? De decepción, a pesar de lo que estamos viendo hoy, ¿no? Entonces, creo que como bien comentaba Yuri antes, creo que los inversores están empezando a entender los procesos de Trump y que sus procesos de negociación son muy ruidosos, hay muchos altos y bajos, que estructuralmente cuando se empieza una negociación para un acuerdo comercial va a haber un castigo, va a haber una amenaza de ruptura, va a haber probablemente un conato de ruptura, como hemos visto, por ejemplo, en los últimos días con la Unión Europea. La semana pasada estaba diciendo, hace solo un par de días, estaba diciendo a la Unión Europea, voy a subiros todavía más los aranceles porque creo que no os estáis comprometiendo en esta negociación, ¿no? Trump parece que se está poniendo un poco nervioso al ver que no se acaban de aterrizar muchos acuerdos comerciales. La Unión Europea le cogió bien el pulso hace unos meses y sabía que le beneficiaba postergar lo máximo posible sentarse en la mesa de negociaciones con Trump, con la esperanza de que la inflación, la falta de productos empezara a notarse en los supermercados norteamericanos y, por ende, en las ratios de popularidad de Trump, ¿no? Poder sentarse frente a un Trump un poquito más debilitado. Y vimos cómo se ponía agresivo hace unos días y ahora hemos visto cómo se despierta el mundo con el anuncio de que se retrasa la introducción de esos aranceles. Los inversores empiezan a entender que esto no es la noticia final. Estamos viendo que las bolsas europeas suben, pero es un poco de alivio, no es una subida de 4 o 5%, ¿no? Es un 1% que se puede deshacer en horas, porque saben que dentro de unos días o de unas semanas vendrá una nueva ruptura de negociaciones, una amenaza y luego probablemente el acuerdo final, ¿no? En un patrón que vemos que se empieza a repetir. Y si miras un poco más allá, detrás del acuerdo que se hizo con el Reino Unido, detrás del acuerdo que probablemente está ya bastante cocinado con Japón y el que se está empezando ahora a esbozar con Europa, lo que queda al final, y de nuevo el Reino Unido es la plantilla para eso, es una economía un poquito más débil que la que teníamos hace un año. Un acuerdo comercial imperfecto, que en el mejor de los casos será solo un poco peor de lo que estamos viendo ahora, con aranceles del 10, 15%, quizás alguna exención para algún producto clave, pero en general aranceles más altos. Y aranceles cuya función no acaba de ser entendida por los inversores, porque esos aranceles no son lo suficientemente altos como para arreglar un problema muy gordo que se le viene a los mercados financieros globales, que es el déficit brutal que tiene la economía norteamericana y que va a provocar va a tener muchos impactos en los precios de los activos y tampoco va a reindustrializar, no es lo suficientemente alto como para reindustrializar Estados Unidos, como para que deje de importarse acero o como que deje de fabricarse nada en China y todo empiece a fabricarse en Estados Unidos, ¿no? Entonces es un poco una estrategia que no va a ningún lado y no está generando entusiasmo, ¿no? En el mejor de los casos, dentro de unos meses, Trump cambia su foco de atención hacia algún tipo de paquete de propuestas alternativas, quizás inmigración, donde es algo, o desregulación, eran ámbitos que estaban en su programa electoral al principio, o sea, en enero, cuando tomó posesión, y a los que no les ha prestado particular atención. Y que esa sería quizás la esperanza. Pero lo que veo es un poquito de desánimo en los inversores. Y en las casas de inversión, falta de criterio, ¿no? Ahora mismo cuando miras qué están recomendando las casas de inversión, pues hay un poquito de algunas que te están recomendando invertir en bolsa y ahí sí que hay acuerdo. Cuando hablan de invertir en bolsa, sobre todo es Europa, ¿no? El activo que más recomendado está, ¿no? Aunque yo personalmente creo que esta semana, por ejemplo, tenemos los resultados de Nvidia. Estas casas tecnológicas que operan a nivel global todavía pueden dar muchas alegrías a los inversores, pero bueno, algunas que dicen que ya es el momento de entrar en la